Blood is supposedly thicker than water, but in my family, it was always thinner than a profit margin. When my older brother smirked across the dinner table and announced he was the new partner at his firm, I just smiled. He didn't know I had just bought the entire company. If you looked up the definition of the golden child in the dictionary, you would find a picture of my older brother, Ronald Sterling. From the time we were kids growing up in a comfortably upper-middle-class home in Stamford, Connecticut, Ronald could do no wrong. He was the high school quarterback, the prom king, the Ivy League legacy admission, and our parents' undisputed pride and joy. I, on the other hand, was Thomas, just Thomas, the quiet younger brother who preferred building computers in the basement to throwing a football in the yard. While Ronald was given a brand new BMW for his high school graduation, I was handed a slightly worn suitcase and a pat on the back when I left for a state university on a partial academic scholarship. My parents, Arthur and Beatrice, never explicitly said they loved Ronald more, but they didn't have to. The framed photographs lining the hallway of our childhood home, 9 of Ronald, 2 of me, spoke volumes. Ronald's entire life was built on a foundation of unearned confidence and an uncanny ability to take credit for other people's hard work. It was a skill that translated beautifully to the corporate world. By his early 30s, he had charmed his way into an upper management position at Harrison and Croft Logistics, a highly respected, mid-sized supply chain management firm based in Manhattan. Every family gathering was the Ronald show. Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, it didn't matter. The conversation inevitably revolved around Ronald's latest corporate conquest, his golf handicap, or his flashy lifestyle. It was during our father's 60th birthday dinner at a ridiculously overpriced steakhouse in Tribeca that the seeds of my ultimate revenge were sown. We were seated around a mahogany table, the clinking of crystal glasses and the murmur of wealthy patrons serving as the soundtrack to yet another episode of Ronald's self-aggrandizement. He was swirling a glass of Macallan 18, wearing a bespoke Brioni suit that probably cost more than my first car. So, David called me into his office on Thursday, Ronald announced, his voice carrying just loudly enough to ensure the neighboring tables knew he was important. He was referring to David Harrison, the aging CEO and surviving founder of Harrison and Croft. He sat me down, poured me a drink, and told me that the board is looking at a massive restructuring. And guess who's at the top of the shortlist for junior partner? My mother gasped, pressing a hand to her pearl necklace. Oh, Ronald, that's wonderful. Arthur, did you hear that? A partner, my father beamed, raising his glass. I always knew you had it in you, son. You're a born leader. To Ronald, to Ronald, I echoed quietly. Taking a sip of my water, Ronald's eyes flicked over to me, gleaming with that familiar, predatory smugness. He loved having an audience, but he loved having me as an audience most of all. Thanks, Tommy. And how are things in your world? Still playing around with those little spreadsheets and startups? What is it you do again? Consulting? He knew exactly what I did. He just loved minimizing it. I run a private equity firm, Ronald, I said evenly, cutting into my steak. Sterling Capital Holdings. We're doing well. Right. Private equity. Ronald chuckled condescendingly, leaning back in his chair, buying up little mom-and-pop shops and flipping them. It's cute. But let me tell you, Tommy, there is nothing quite like playing in the big leagues. When you have an actual stake in a major player like Harrison and Croft, well, it's a whole different ballgame. You need vision. You need killer instinct. I chewed my food slowly, suppressing a laugh. What Ronald didn't know, what my parents didn't know, because I preferred to keep my wealth quiet and my life private, was that Sterling Capital Holdings wasn't flipping mom-and-pop shops. Over the last 8 years, my partner Harper Jenkins and I had quietly acquired, restructured, and sold several massive tech and logistics portfolios. I wasn't just wealthy. I was independently, obscenely wealthy. My net worth dwarfed the entire market valuation of Harrison and Croft. But I had learned early on that arguing with Ronald was a losing game. The only way to win was to let him talk. Let him expose his blind spots. And wait. I'm sure it takes a lot of killer instinct, Ronald, I replied mildly. It does, he said, adjusting his Rolex. And frankly, the company needs me. David Harrison is stuck in the past. He doesn't understand modern aggressive expansion. Once I get my name on that letterhead, things are going to change. I'm going to trim the fat, start squeezing our vendors, and double our margins. That phrase caught my attention. Squeezing the vendors. In the logistics industry, burning bridges with your vendors was a fast track to bankruptcy. As the dinner ended and my parents hugged Ronald goodbye as if he were off to cure a major disease, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Harper, my CFO. Just got a fascinating prospectus across my desk. Distressed asset in the logistics sector. Owner is looking for a quiet, fast exit before the Q3 numbers hit the press. You're going to want to see this. Who is it? I texted back as I walked toward my waiting car. A moment later, her reply flashed on the screen. Harrison and Croft. I stopped dead in my tracks on the New York sidewalk, looking back toward the restaurant where Ronald was waiting for his valet-parked Porsche. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face for the first time that evening. By 8 a.m. the following Monday, I was sitting in the glass-walled conference room of Sterling Capital Holdings, staring at the financial disclosures for Harrison and Croft. Harper, a brilliant financial analyst with an eye for corporate rot, was projecting their quarterly earnings onto the screen. It's a house of cards, Tom, Harper said, tapping her laser pointer against a severely dipping red line on the graph. From the outside, they look like a legacy powerhouse, but internally, they are hemorrhaging cash. Operating costs are up 30%, and client retention has plummeted over the last 18 months. I leaned forward, steepling my fingers. What happened 18 months ago? Harper clicked to the next slide, displaying an organizational chart. David Harrison promoted a new director of North American operations. Since then, 3 major accounts, including the Miller contract, which accounted for 20% of their gross revenue, walked away. I didn't even need to look at the name on the chart. Let me guess. Ronald Sterling. Harper raised an eyebrow. Your brother? Yes. Show me the performance metrics for his department, I requested. The numbers were staggering, but not in a good way. Ronald had indeed been applying his killer instinct. He had slashed the customer service budget, alienated long-term vendors by aggressively renegotiating locked contracts, and fostered a toxic internal culture that resulted in a massive turnover of senior account managers. To hide the bleeding, Ronald had been cooking the books not illegally, but highly unethically. He was recognizing projected revenue from unsigned contracts and deferring actual losses into future quarters. It was a classic pump-and-dump corporate maneuver designed to make his personal metrics look phenomenal on paper, just long enough to secure a partnership. Once he was a partner with equity, the inevitable crash would be the entire firm's problem, not just his. David Harrison is exhausted, Harper explained, sitting down opposite me. His co-founder, Greg Croft, passed away 3 years ago. David is 71. He has no heirs interested in the business, and he realizes he's lost control of his own company. He wants out. A complete buyout, 50 million cash, total assumption of debt, but it has to be completely confidential until the ink is dry. He doesn't want to panic among the remaining clients. 50 million is a steal for their infrastructure alone, I murmured, my mind racing. If we clean house, restore the vendor relationships, and bring back the Miller account, the company is easily worth 120 million. It's a textbook turnaround for us, Harper agreed. But are you sure you want to touch this? It's your brother. I looked at the photograph of Ronald on the organizational chart. The smug, polished smile, the arrogance. He was days away from securing a partnership in a company he was actively destroying. A promotion he would undoubtedly rub in my face for the rest of my life. Set up a private meeting with David Harrison, I said softly. Just him and me. 3 days later, I sat across from David Harrison in a dimly lit private room at a golf club in Westchester. David looked older than his 71 years. The bags under his eyes were heavy, and he carried the weary demeanor of a man watching his life's work slowly sink. He looked at my business card, then up at me, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. Thomas Sterling. You wouldn't happen to be related to? Ronald Sterling is my older brother, I confirmed evenly. David visibly stiffened, instinctively reaching for his briefcase. Mr. Sterling, if this is some sort of backdoor play by Ronald to secure equity, David, please. Sit down, I interrupted, my tone firm but respectful. I am here on behalf of Sterling Capital Holdings. My relationship with my brother is purely biological, and frankly, completely strained. I am here because you have a bleeding company, and I have the capital and the expertise to save it. I slid a thick folder across the table. This is our due diligence report. We've audited your shadow ledgers. I know exactly how much trouble Harrison and Croft is in, and more importantly, I know exactly why you are in trouble. David opened the folder, his eyes scanning the pages. As he read my team's brutally honest assessment of Ronald's department, his shoulders slumped. I trusted him, David whispered, rubbing his temples. When Greg died, I was lost. Ronald was charismatic. He had all these modern buzzwords, these aggressive strategies. He promised me he could modernize us. By the time I realized he was just burning the furniture to keep the house warm, he had entrenched himself. The board loves him because he presents them with fantasy projections. He's angling for a partnership, I said. David scoffed bitterly. He's demanding it. He essentially threatened to take his book of business to our competitors if we don't make him a named partner by the end of the month. The board is terrified of losing him. If he leaves, he takes nothing, I countered. His book of business hates him. Robert Miller walked away purely because of Ronald's condescension. I happened to play squash with Robert. I know for a fact he would return to Harrison and Croft tomorrow if Ronald was out of the picture. David looked up, a glimmer of hope piercing through his exhaustion. You can bring the Miller account back? I can bring them back. And I can stabilize your vendor network within 30 days, I said, leaning in. But I need full control. I want a 100% buyout. I will meet your asking price of $50 million. And I will personally guarantee your exit package. But the deal must close within 2 weeks. And you cannot tell the board, or my brother, until the transition is legally complete. David stared at me for a long time. He was searching for the catch, looking for the same snake oil charm my brother possessed. But I didn't offer him a charismatic grin or empty promises. I offered him cold, hard numbers and a way out. Why? David finally asked. Why buy a distressed company just to fire your own brother? Because it's a brilliant investment, David, I replied, extending my hand. And because my brother desperately needs a lesson in humility, I intend to provide both. David looked at my hand, a slow, tired smile finally breaking across his face. He reached out and shook it firmly. We have a deal, Thomas! The next 2 weeks were a blur of lawyers, non-disclosure agreements, and frantic wire transfers. Behind the scenes, the foundation of Harrison and Croft was shifting completely, while on the surface, everything remained the same. Ronald, completely oblivious to the hurricane gathering off his coast, was living his best life. My mother called me 3 times that week, breathless with excitement, to remind me that Ronald's partnership ceremony was coming up. He had actually convinced the board to host a lavish cocktail reception at a midtown hotel to announce his promotion. My parents were flying in for it. You absolutely have to be there, Tommy, my mother had chirped over the phone. It's the biggest day of your brother's life. He's going to be a partner. You could really learn a lot from him if you just paid attention. I wouldn't miss it for the world, Mom, I had replied, looking down at the freshly signed, legally binding acquisition documents sitting on my desk. I plan on taking copious notes. The trap was fully set. The ink was dry. Harrison and Croft no longer belonged to David Harrison. And it certainly didn't belong to the board. It belonged to me. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel was dripping in manufactured opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the room, illuminating towers of chilled shrimp, roaming waiters carrying trays of Dom Perignon, and a string quartet playing a modernized classical arrangement in the corner. It was exactly the kind of ostentatious display my brother Ronald thrived in. He had spared no expense well. To be accurate, he had spared none of the company's expense, billing the entire night as a client retention and morale-building event. In reality, it was a coronation. I arrived 30 minutes late, intentionally bypassing the red carpet photo backdrop Ronald had arranged near the coat check. I wore a tailored but understated charcoal suit, a sharp contrast to the aggressive pinstripes and flashy pocket squares favored by the mid-level executives swarming the room. It didn't take long to find my parents. Arthur and Beatrice were holding court near the ice sculpture, a literal carving of the Harrison and Croft logo beaming as if they had personally founded the company. "Thomas, you made it!" My mother, Beatrice, called out, waving me over. She reached out and adjusted my lapel, her eyes immediately scanning the room for her favorite son. "Isn't this just magnificent? Have you seen the spread?" Ronald organized the whole thing. "It's very impressive, Mom," I said, accepting a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter. My father clapped me heavily on the shoulder. "Take notes, Tommy. This is what happens when you put your nose to the grindstone and play the corporate game the right way. Your brother is making history tonight, youngest partner in the firm's history." Before I could offer a neutral response, the crowd parted, and the man of the hour appeared. Ronald looked like he had stepped out of a magazine ad for Wall Street sharks. His smile was blinding, his hair perfectly coiffed, and he was flanked by two senior board members, Cynthia Powell, the head of legal, and William Bradley, the VP of operations. Both were hanging on to Ronald's every word, desperate to align themselves with the ascending star. "Tommy!" Ronald boomed, extending a hand. He pulled me into a half hug that was more about asserting dominance than expressing affection. "Glad you could pull yourself away from your little spreadsheets to see how the big boys celebrate." "I wouldn't have missed it, Ronald," I replied smoothly, meeting his gaze. Ronald turned to Cynthia and William, gesturing toward me with his champagne flute. "This is my little brother, Thomas. He dabbles in small-scale private equity. You know, flipping minor assets. I keep telling him he needs to think bigger. But we can't all have the killer instinct, right?" Cynthia offered a tight, polite smile, while William chuckled obligingly. "Well, we're certainly glad to have your brother steering the ship here," William said, practically salivating. "The board is very excited about the aggressive expansion plans Ronald has drafted for Q4. It's all about synergy, Bill," Ronald said smoothly, slipping his free hand into his pocket. "We need to trim the fat, cut the dead weight. The old guard was too sentimental about vendor relationships. In modern logistics, you either squeeze the margins or you die." I saw David Harrison standing near the back of the room. The aging CEO held a glass of bourbon, watching Ronald with a look of quiet, melancholic disgust. David caught my eye across the crowded room. He didn't smile, but he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The paperwork had cleared at 4 p.m. that afternoon. The wire transfer had hit David's offshore accounts. I gave David a subtle nod in return. "Listen, Tommy," Ronald said, leaning in close, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper meant to sound brotherly but dripping with condescension. "But if you ever need a little seed capital for one of your little ventures, or maybe a consulting gig to pad out your resume, you just let me know. Once the ink dries on my partnership papers on Monday morning, I'm going to have a lot of discretionary power." "I appreciate the offer, Ronald," I said, taking a sip of my water to hide my growing smile. "But I think my current ventures are going to yield a massive return very soon. I'm feeling incredibly optimistic about Monday." "That's the spirit," Ronald laughed loudly, turning back to the crowd. He clinked his glass with a fork, calling for quiet. The string quartet faded out, The room hushed as all eyes turned to my brother. Friends, family, colleagues, Ronald began, projecting his voice perfectly. When I joined Harrison and Croft, I saw a sleeping giant, a legacy company with a lot of heart, but one that needed a wake-up call. I want to thank David Harrison and the board for trusting my vision. We are about to embark on a new era of profitability, ruthlessness, and market dominance. To Harrison and Croft. To Harrison and Croft, the room echoed. My parents cheered the loudest. I just stood there, watching my brother soak in the applause for a company he no longer worked for. Monday morning arrived with a crisp, biting chill in the Manhattan air. At 8:45 a.m., I walked through the revolving glass doors of the Harrison and Croft headquarters on Madison Avenue, flanked by my CFO, Harper Jenkins, and two of our top corporate attorneys. The reception area was bustling. I ignored the front desk. Swiping the universal executive keycard David Harrison had messengered to my apartment over the weekend. The glass security gates parted seamlessly. We took the private elevator up to the 40th floor. The executive boardroom was at the end of a long, mahogany-paneled hallway. Through the frosted glass double doors, I could hear the muted sounds of the board of directors assembling. Inside, the mood was electric. Ronald had arrived early. Naturally, he was seated confidently at the right hand of the head chair, his custom Mont Blanc pen laid out perfectly parallel to a leather-bound portfolio. Cynthia Powell and William Bradley were already there, chatting animatedly with three other board members. At exactly 9 a.m., David Harrison walked in. He looked entirely different from the exhausted man I had met at the golf club. The heavy burden of a failing legacy had been lifted from his shoulders. He walked with a renewed lightness, carrying a single manila folder. The room quieted down. Ronald flashed a brilliant, predatory smile. "Morning, David," Ronald said smoothly. "I believe we have a rather momentous agenda today. I've brought the revised Q4 projections, assuming my new equity stake is ratified this morning." David didn't sit down. He stood at the head of the table, placing his hands flat on the polished mahogany. "Good morning, everyone," David said, his voice steady and remarkably clear. "Before we review any projections or discuss any partnerships, there is an urgent matter of corporate restructuring that takes immediate precedence." Ronald frowned slightly, shifting in his chair. "David, with all due respect, the board agreed that finalizing my partnership was the first item on the docket. We need to present a unified front to the shareholders. Harrison and Croft is a privately held corporation." "Ronald," David corrected mildly. "I held 68% of the voting shares, which means I did not need board approval for the transaction that occurred last Friday afternoon." A pin-drop silence fell over the room. Cynthia Powell sat up straight, her legal instincts suddenly flashing red. "Transaction? David, what are you talking about?" "Effective Friday at 4 p.m., I resigned as CEO of Harrison and Croft," David announced, looking around the room. "And I sold my majority stake in its entirety. The company has been acquired." The boardroom erupted. William Bradley half stood from his chair, his face flushing red. "Acquired? By whom? You can't just sell the firm out from under us." "He absolutely can, William," Ronald snapped, his voice tight with sudden panic. He turned his glare onto David. "Who did you sell it to, David? A competitor? Vanguard? Who?" "He sold it to me." I pushed open the frosted glass doors and stepped into the boardroom, with Harper and my legal team stepping in smoothly behind me. The color drained from Ronald's face so fast I thought he might actually pass out. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently for a few seconds before his brain caught up with his eyes. "Tommy?" Ronald barked, letting out a sharp, confused laugh. He looked from me to David, then back to me. "What kind of sick joke is this?" "David, call security. My brother doesn't belong in here." I walked calmly to the head of the table. David stepped aside, gesturing gracefully to the empty leather chair. I didn't sit. I stood exactly where David had been, looking down the length of the table at the terrified executives, letting my eyes finally rest on my brother. "It's not a joke, Ronald," I said, my voice dropping the polite, brotherly cadence I had used for 30 years. It was cold, sharp, and strictly business. Sterling Capital Holdings acquired Harrison and Croft in a leveraged buyout. I am the sole managing partner of Sterling Capital. As of this morning, I own this company. All of it. That's impossible, Ronald stammered, his polished veneer cracking into a million pieces. You run a boutique firm. You don't have the capital to buy. His voice trailed off as Harper began passing out thick, bound dossiers to the board members. We have a diversified portfolio worth just under $2 billion, I corrected quietly. But we can discuss my finances later. Right now, we need to discuss yours. Cynthia Powell was quickly flipping through the dossier, her eyes widening. These are the shadow ledgers. These are the unaudited internal metrics for the North American Operations Division. Exactly, I said, nodding to Harper. Harper tapped a tablet, and the large monitor at the end of the boardroom sprang to life, displaying a devastatingly clear graph. A bright red line plummeted toward the bottom axis. Over the last 18 months, the Director of North American Operations, Ronald Sterling, has actively alienated 12 of our top 15 vendors, I stated, walking slowly down the side of the table. He slashed customer service budgets by 40% to artificially inflate his quarterly profit margins, leading to the direct loss of the Miller account, which constituted 20% of our gross revenue. That's a lie, Ronald shouted, slamming his hand on the table. I was modernizing. You have to break a few eggs to make an omelette. The board approved my strategies. The board approved the fraudulent projections you fed them, I shot back, my voice echoing off the glass walls. You deferred millions in operational losses into Q1 of next year, completely hiding the fact that this company was technically insolvent. You were days away from bankrupting this firm just so you could get your name on the letterhead. The board members were staring at Ronald in horror. William Bradley pushed his chair away from Ronald as if my brother had suddenly caught fire. You don't know what you're talking about, Ronald hissed, standing up. The veins in his neck were bulging. I built this division. I'm the only reason we survived the last fiscal year. If you try to push me out, I will walk, and I will take my entire book of business with me. Every client I brought in will follow me. I stopped pacing and looked at him. A slow, genuine smile spreading across my face. Take them, I challenged softly. Ronald Frozer, go ahead, I continued. Call Robert Miller, right now. Tell him you're leaving. I pulled my phone from my pocket, unlocked it, and tossed it onto the mahogany table. It slid to a stop right in front of Ronald. The screen was open to a text thread from Robert Miller, dated 2 hours ago. Tom saw the press release on the wire. If Ronald is officially gone, Miller Logistics is ready to sign a new 5-year exclusive with H&C Let's Play Squash Thursday. Ronald stared at the glowing screen. His hands began to shake slightly. He looked up at me, the arrogant, untouchable golden boy finally realizing he had brought a knife to a drone strike. Tommy! Thomas! Ronald stammered, his voice dropping into a desperate, pleading register. We're brothers. You can't do this. I'm supposed to be a partner. You were never going to be a partner, Ronald, I said, retrieving my phone and slipping it back into my pocket. You are a liability. You are a toxic asset. I leaned over the table, planting my hands firmly, bringing my face inches from his. Your employment at Harrison and Croft is terminated, effective immediately. For gross negligence and financial misconduct, I said, pronouncing every word with crystal clarity. Harper has your severance package. It's the legal minimum. Security is waiting outside the door with an empty cardboard box. You have exactly 15 minutes to clear out your desk. For a moment, the only sound in the boardroom was the hum of the ventilation system. Ronald's face transitioned from a sickly, pale white to a mottled, furious red. He looked frantically around the table, seeking an ally, a lifeline, anything to anchor him to the reality he thought he commanded. He locked eyes with William Bradley. Bill, come on. Tell him. Tell him about the Q4 expansion strategy. We're a team. William, whose self-preservation instincts were highly tuned, didn't even blink. He calmly adjusted his tie and looked at his former golden goose with utter detachment. There is no team, Ronald. You falsified internal metrics and jeopardized my standing with the shareholders. Frankly, I think Mr. Sterling's decision is incredibly measured. I would have called the authorities. Cynthia Powell nodded in agreement, sliding Ronald's fraudulent dossier away from her as if it were contaminated. The legal department fully supports the actions of our new managing partner. The absolute betrayal in Ronald's eyes was almost cinematic. The people he had spent the last 18 months whining, dining, and manipulating had turned on him in less than 60 seconds. He looked back at me, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. You planned this, Ronald hissed, his voice trembling with a potent mix of rage and humiliation. You sat there at dinner. You stood there at my party, knowing you were going to do this. You're a sociopath, Tommy. I'm a businessman, Ronald, I replied, my tone completely devoid of emotion. You were driving a $50 million asset into a brick wall. I took the keys away. Now, I suggest you leave before Harper asks the security guards to physically assist you. Your 15 minutes are ticking. Ronald stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floorboards. He didn't bother grabbing his custom Mont Blanc pen or his leather portfolio. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the boardroom, the frosted glass doors slamming shut behind him. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the tension bleed out of my shoulders. I turned to the remaining board members, offering them a reassuring, professional smile. Now that the unpleasantness is handled, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about how we are going to make Harrison and Croft the undisputed leader in North American logistics again. The real storm, however, didn't hit until 3 hours later. I was sitting in what used to be David Harrison's corner office, looking out over the Manhattan skyline, when my private cell phone rang. The caller ID flashed with my parents' home number. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Hello, Dad, I said calmly. Thomas Arthur Sterling, what the hell is going on? My father bellowed through the receiver. The sheer volume forced me to pull the phone an inch away from my ear. I could hear my mother weeping hysterically in the background. Ronald just showed up at our hotel with a cardboard box. He says you bought his company and fired him. Tell me this is some kind of sick misunderstanding. It's not a misunderstanding, Dad. I acquired Harrison and Croft through my private equity firm, I explained, keeping my voice steady and reasonable. And I terminated Ronald's employment because he was engaged in gross financial misconduct. He nearly bankrupted the company. Bankrupted? My father yelled, completely refusing to process the information. He was the youngest partner in their history. He was a visionary. You did this out of spite, Tom. You've always been jealous of your brother, always lurking in the shadows. And now you've sabotaged his career because you couldn't stand to see him succeed. I closed my eyes, feeling a strange, hollow sense of closure. I had expected this reaction. For 30 years, Ronald had been their son, and I had been a distant, cold planet. No amount of financial ledgers or undeniable proof was ever going to change their narrative. I didn't sabotage him, Dad. He sabotaged himself, I said softly. I just refused to pay the bill for his arrogance. I'll send Cynthia Powell, my head of legal, over to your hotel with the audit files. You can read them yourself. But I won't apologize for making a sound investment, and I won't apologize for holding Ronald accountable. You are no son of mine, my father spat out. Don't you ever call this house again. The line went dead. I set the phone down on the massive oak desk. I had lost my family. But in truth, I had never really had them to begin with. The ache in my chest was brief, quickly replaced by the profound, undeniable peace of a man who had finally stopped trying to win a rigged game. The next 6 months were a masterclass in corporate resurrection. Harper and I completely gutted Ronald's toxic infrastructure. We reinstated the customer service budgets, personally apologized to the alienated vendors, and renegotiated fair, long-term contracts. True to his word, Robert Miller signed a massive 5-year exclusive deal with us the moment Ronald's termination went public. By the end of Q2, Harrison and Croft wasn't just stabilized. We were showing a 22% increase in legitimate, sustainable profit. As for Ronald, the corporate world is surprisingly small, and word travels fast. Despite his polished resume, the sudden, unceremonious exit from Harrison and Croft, coupled with the quiet whispers of cooked books, made him a radioactive asset. The top-tier firms wouldn't touch him. The last I heard through the industry grapevine, the former Golden Boy of Stamford had been forced to take a position as a regional shift manager for a mid-level trucking depot in New Jersey. There were no crystal chandeliers, no Dom Perignon, and no sycophantic board members to applaud his brilliance. Just long hours, thin margins, and a boss who didn't care about his Ivy League pedigree. I, on the other hand, stayed quietly in the shadows, right where I belonged. Only now, I owned the shadows. Blood might be thicker than water, but accountability is the great equalizer. Ronald spent his life banking on unearned privilege, while I quietly built an empire in his shadow. Sometimes, the most brutal family interventions don't happen around a dining table. They happen in a boardroom. I didn't just buy a company that day, I bought my peace of mind, and that was worth every penny.